This is HOA debrief, and the timeline is absurd. Welcome. Settle in, because this one gets wild. I am here to keep order, Karen screamed, and she slammed a stack of proxy forms on the table so hard the entire conference room went silent. She held them above her head like they were the 10 Commandments. Proxies are legal magic, she shouted. I can vote for anyone who does not show up, and that means I decide what happens here. I stood in the doorway of the Autumn Ridge Association meeting room and watched her wave those forms like a weapon. My name is not important. What matters is I am a union electrician apprentice in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and I have strict job site start times. I cannot afford to take time off for surprise hearings and forced meetings. Karen Kelly knew that. She counted on it. She turned and locked eyes with me. Her black shoulder-length hair swung as she spun. She wore a blue blazer with the hood up even though we were indoors, and she had a bundle of zip ties clipped to her belt like she was about to install a campaign sign in the parking lot. If you want mercy, move somewhere without an HOA, she said. I did not move. I held a folded evidence packet in a plastic sleeve. I had been holding it for 3 days waiting for this exact moment. 2 weeks earlier, a vendor invoice appeared in the budget that made no sense. It was for landscaping work at a property that had been vacant for 2 years. The amount was $1,400. The line item said compliance inspection and remediation. I sent an email to the board asking what that meant. Karen replied within 5 minutes. She said the invoice was legitimate and I should mind my own business. That was my first clue. Karen never replied to emails that fast unless she was defensive. I work nights. I run conduit and pull wire on commercial sites. I get home at 6 in the morning and I sleep until 2 in the afternoon. My schedule does not leave room for HOA nonsense. But that invoice bothered me. I pulled up the budget portal and started looking at old line items. I found 3 more invoices with the same vendor name, same vague description, same $1,400 amount, all dated within the last 18 months. I called the vendor. A guy named Rick answered. He told me he had done work for Autumn Ridge Association, but he could not remember the details. I asked if he had photos or work orders. He said Karen handled all the coordination and she always paid in checks, so he did not keep digital records. He paused. Then he said something that made my skin crawl. She asked me to date one of the invoices 2 months earlier than the actual work. I told her I could not do that, but she said it was just for accounting purposes. That was my second clue. Someone was manipulating dates. I started digging into old meeting minutes. Autumn Ridge Association keeps minutes on a shared portal, but the older files are locked behind a board access wall. I submitted a records request. Karen replied the next day. She said the request was too broad and I needed to specify exact dates. I rewrote the request with a 6-month range. She replied again. She said I needed to submit the request on a paper form and mail it to the management company. That was my third clue. She was stalling. I printed the form, filled it out, and mailed it certified. 2 weeks passed. No response. I emailed Karen and asked for a status update. She said the management company never received it. I sent her a photo of the certified mail receipt with the delivery confirmation. She said the receipt did not prove what was in the envelope. I stared at that reply for a full minute. That was when I knew she was hiding something big. I went to the management company office in person. It was a squat brick building on the south side of Sioux Falls next to a strip mall. The receptionist told me Karen had called ahead and said I was not authorized to pick up records without board approval. I asked to speak to the supervisor. She said the supervisor was in a meeting. I sat in the lobby and waited. 40 minutes later, a woman in a gray pantsuit came out. Her name was Linda. She looked tired. I explained the situation. I showed her the certified mail receipt. I showed her Karen's reply. Linda sighed and said, "Let me pull the file." She came back 10 minutes later with a folder. She opened it and frowned. "There is no record of your request in the system," she said. "But I do see a note from Karen dated 3 days ago. It says you have been making harassing phone calls to vendors and board members." I felt my jaw tighten. "That is a lie," I said. Linda looked at me. "I believe you," she said. "Karen does this. She has done it to 3 other homeowners in the past year. We have been trying to get the board to replace her, but she controls the proxy votes." That phrase hit me like a hammer. Proxy votes. I asked Linda if she had records of old proxy forms. She said those were kept by the board secretary. Karen was the board secretary. I went home and pulled up every meeting packet I could find online. I found one from 2 years ago. It was a special election to approve a landscaping contract. The vote passed with a margin of 30 proxies. The packet included a scanned image of the proxy form stack. I zoomed in. Every single signature looked identical. Same pen, same slant, same loops on the capital letters. I printed the image. I took it to a notary public I knew from the Union Hall. She looked at the signatures and said, "Those are not real. Someone traced them or forged them." I asked her if she could write a statement. She said she could, but it would not hold up in court without a handwriting expert. I thanked her and left. I needed more proof. I needed something that Karen could not explain away. I went back to the budget portal and downloaded every invoice from the past 3 years. I sorted them by vendor. I found a pattern. Every time there was a compliance enforcement action against a homeowner, there was a corresponding invoice from the same vendor within 2 weeks. The amounts varied, but the description was always the same: compliance inspection and remediation. I cross-referenced the enforcement actions with the board minutes. In every case, the enforcement action was initiated by Karen. In every case, the homeowner either paid the fine or sold their house within 6 months. I made a spreadsheet. I color-coded the entries. I saved it to a thumb drive. Then I got a letter in the mail. It was from the HOA. It said I was in violation of Section 12.4 of the Community Guidelines, unauthorized external modifications. The letter included a photo of my front door. In the photo, there was a small wooden sign hanging on a nail. The sign said, "No soliciting." I stared at the photo. I had never hung that sign. I did not own that sign. I walked outside and looked at my door. The sign was there. It was brand new. The nail was still shiny. I took a photo with my phone. I checked the metadata. The photo was taken at 7:32 a.m. I was at work. I pulled up my time card. I had clocked in at 6:50 a.m. Someone had planted the sign while I was gone. I went to my neighbor's house. His name was Travis. He was a contractor who worked from home. I asked him if he had seen anyone at my door that morning. He said, "Yeah, Karen was there around 7. She had a hammer and a bag. I thought you asked her to hang something." I felt my pulse spike. "Did you take a photo?" I asked. He pulled out his phone. He showed me a photo. It was time-stamped 7:29 a.m. In the photo, Karen was standing on my porch holding a hammer. The sign was in her other hand. Travis said she looked around a bunch before she knocked. When no one answered, she just hung it and left. I asked him to send me the photo. He did. That was my 4th clue. Karen was staging violations. I updated my spreadsheet. I added a new tab. I labeled it Evidence of Fraud. The next day, I got another letter. This one said I had 72 hours to remove the sign or I would be fined $250. It also said I was required to attend a compliance hearing at the management company office. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday at 10 a.m. I worked Wednesday night. I would be asleep at 10 a.m. on Thursday. I called the management company. Linda answered. I explained the situation. She said, Karen scheduled that hearing. She did not clear it with me. I can move it to the afternoon if you want. I said yes. She moved it to 4 p.m. Thursday came. I went to the hearing. It was in a small conference room with a folding table and 6 chairs. Karen was already there. She sat at the head of the table. She had a binder in front of her. The binder was labeled Compliance Actions. She also had her bundle of zip ties clipped to her belt and a megaphone sitting on the table next to her purse. Linda sat at the other end of the table. She looked uncomfortable. Karen opened the binder. She flipped to a page with my name on it. She said, "You are in violation of Section 12.4. You hung a sign without board approval. The fine is $250. You have 10 days to pay." I pulled out my evidence packet. I said, "I did not hang that sign. You did." I handed her the photo from Travis. I handed her my time card. I handed her the metadata printout from my phone. Karen looked at the photo. Her face went pale. Then she smiled. She said, "This does not prove anything. Anyone could have printed a fake time card." Linda leaned forward. "That is not a fake time card," she said. "I can verify it with his employer." Karen ignored her. She turned to me. She said, "Even if you did not hang the sign, it was on your property. You are responsible for everything on your property. The fine stands." I felt my chest tighten. "That is not in the guidelines," I said. Karen pulled a laminated sheet from her binder. She slid it across the table. She said, "Section 12.4, subsection C. Homeowner is responsible for all visible external modifications, regardless of intent." I read the sheet. The subsection did not exist in the version of the guidelines I had downloaded from the portal. I pulled out my phone. I opened the portal. I navigated to the guidelines. I showed her the screen. "This version does not have subsection C," I said. Karen leaned back. She said, "The board approved an amendment last month. It has not been uploaded yet." Linda stood up. She said, "Karen, I need to see the amendment approval in the minutes." Karen waved her hand. She said, "It was an emergency vote. We did not have time to document it." Linda crossed her arms. She said, "That is not how this works. If there is no documentation, the amendment is not valid." Karen slammed her hand on the table. She said, "Go ahead and call whoever you want. I have a committee for that." Linda looked at me. She said, "The fine is suspended pending review of the amendment claim. You can go." I stood up. Karen pointed at me. She said, "You are not done. You still owe fees for this hearing. $50. I looked at Linda. Linda shook her head. She said, "There is no hearing fee in the bylaws." Karen opened her binder again. She flipped to another page. She said, "Special enforcement surcharge. Approved last year." Linda said, "Show me the approval." Karen closed the binder. She said, "I will email it to you." I walked out. My hands were shaking. That night I could not sleep. I kept thinking about the proxy forms. I kept thinking about the invoices. I kept thinking about the staged sign. I decided to reopen the cold case. 2 years ago, a homeowner named Bill Chen had filed a complaint with the board. He claimed someone had stolen money from the reserve fund. He claimed the landscaping contract vote was rigged. He claimed Karen had forged proxy votes. The board dismissed his complaint. They said he had no proof. Bill sold his house 3 months later and moved to Iowa. I found Bill's phone number on an old HOA email thread. I called him. He answered on the 3rd ring. I explained who I was. I explained what had happened to me. I asked him if he still had any records from his complaint. He said, "I kept everything. I knew she was going to come after someone else eventually." He emailed me a zip file. It contained scanned copies of proxy forms, board minutes, and a spreadsheet tracking reserve fund transfers. He also sent a photo of a complaint log entry. The entry was written in a voice that matched Karen's exact phrasing. It accused Bill of harassing board members and making false accusations. I compared the complaint log entry to the note Linda had shown me. The wording was identical. That was my fifth clue. Karen was using the same playbook. I called Bill again. I asked him if he ever got a resolution. He said no. He said the board refused to investigate. He said Karen threatened to file a restraining order against him if he kept pushing. I asked him if he would be willing to testify if I reopened the case. He said absolutely. I spent the next 3 days building a case file. I compiled the proxy forms. I compiled the invoices. I compiled the photos. I compiled the complaint log entries. I compiled the timeline. I found a pattern. Every enforcement action Karen initiated was followed by a vendor invoice. Every vendor invoice was followed by a compliance fee charged to the homeowner. Every compliance fee was deposited into an account controlled by the board secretary. Karen was the board secretary. I submitted a formal complaint to the management company. I attached the case file. I requested an independent audit. Linda called me the next day. She said, "I forwarded your complaint to the board president. He wants to meet with you." The board president's name was Mark. He was a retired insurance adjuster. He had been on the board for 6 years. He had never questioned Karen. We met at a coffee shop on West 41st Street. Mark ordered a black coffee. I ordered nothing. I handed him a printed copy of the case file. He read it in silence. When he finished, he looked up. He said, "This is serious." I said, "I know." He said, "If this is true, Karen has been embezzling HOA funds for at least 2 years, maybe longer." I said, "That is what I think." He said, "I need to bring this to the full board. But I need more proof. I need something that ties the vendor invoices directly to Karen." I said, "I am working on it." He said, "Work fast. Karen is planning to call a special meeting next week. She wants to vote on a new enforcement policy. If it passes, she will have even more power." I left the coffee shop and drove to the vendor's office. It was a small warehouse on the east side of town. A faded sign out front said, "Rick's Landscape and Repair." Rick was in the back, loading bags of mulch onto a trailer. I introduced myself. I told him I was investigating HOA fraud. I asked him if he would be willing to talk. He wiped his hands on his jeans. He said, "I have been waiting for someone to ask." He took me into his office. It was a cluttered room with a desk, a filing cabinet, and a space heater. He pulled out a folder. He said, "Karen called me 6 times last year. Every time, she asked me to bill the HOA for work I never did. She said it was for compliance enforcement, and I would get paid in cash. I asked him if he kept records. He said, I kept the call logs. I kept the checks. I kept the emails." He handed me the folder. Inside were copies of checks signed by Karen. There were also printed emails where Karen explicitly told Rick to backdate invoices and stage compliance photos. I stared at the emails. One of them said, "Make sure the photo shows the violation clearly. I will handle the rest." Rick said, "I stopped working with her after the 3rd time. She called me last month and tried to get me to do it again. I told her no. She said if I did not cooperate, she would report me to the state for unlicensed work." I asked him if he would testify. He said yes. I thanked him and left. I had everything I needed. I called Mark. I told him I had proof. He said, "Bring it to the board meeting tonight. Karen does not know you are coming." I said, "She is going to fight." He said, "Let her." The board meeting was at 7 p.m. It was held in the community center on the north side of the neighborhood. The room was set up with a long table at the front and rows of chairs facing it. About 20 homeowners were already seated when I arrived. Karen sat at the center of the table. She had her binder open. Her megaphone sat on the table. Her bundle of zip ties hung from her belt. She looked calm. Mark sat to her right. 2 other board members sat on her left. Linda sat in the corner, taking notes. I sat in the back row. I held my evidence packet in my lap. Mark called the meeting to order. He said, "We have a complaint that requires board attention. I am going to ask the complainant to present his findings." Karen looked up. Her eyes locked on me. She said, "This is not on the agenda." Mark said, "It is now." I stood up and walked to the front. I opened my evidence packet. I placed the proxy forms on the table. I placed the invoices. I placed the emails. I placed the photos. I said, "Karen Kelly has been embezzling HOA funds for at least 2 years. She has been staging violations, forging proxy votes, and billing the association for work that was never done. I have proof." Karen stood up. She pointed at me. She said, "That is defamation. I will sue you for every penny you have." I pulled out the check copies. I said, "These are signed by you. They are made out to a vendor who confirms you asked him to backdate invoices." Karen grabbed the checks. She looked at them. Her face went red. She said, "This does not prove anything. Vendors lie." I pulled out my phone. I said, "Rick is on speaker." I dialed. Rick answered. I said, "Rick, can you confirm what you told me this afternoon?" Rick's voice came through the speaker. He said yes. "Karen Kelly asked me to bill the HOA for work I never did. She paid me in checks signed by her. She told me to backdate the invoices and stage compliance photos. I have emails that prove it." The room went silent. Karen lunged for my phone. Mark grabbed her arm. He said, "Karen, sit down." She pulled away. She said, "This is a setup. He is trying to destroy me because I enforced the rules." A neighbor in the front row stood up. She said, "You fined me $300 for a flower pot. You said it was an unauthorized external modification. Then you tried to charge me a compliance fee." Another neighbor stood. He said, "You towed my truck from my own driveway. You said it was blocking the sidewalk. It was not." Karen pointed at them. She said, "If you want mercy, move somewhere without an HOA." Mark said, "Karen, you are suspended from the board effective immediately. We are calling for an independent audit." Karen grabbed her binder. She said, "You cannot suspend me. I have the proxies. I control the votes." I pulled out the scanned proxy forms Bill had sent me. I held them up. I said, "These proxies are forged. Every signature is identical." I had a notary confirm it. Karen froze. She stared at the forms. She said, "Those are fake." I said, "They are from the association's own records. I have the original file from 2 years ago." Mark said, "Karen, if you do not leave voluntarily, I will call the police." Karen grabbed her megaphone. She pointed it at me. She said, "You have no idea what you just started." I said, "Yes, I do." She stormed out. The door slammed behind her. The room erupted. Neighbors were talking over each other. Mark banged his gavel. He said, "We will reconvene next week with the audit results." Meeting adjourned. I walked out into the parking lot. Travis was waiting by my truck. He said, "That was intense." I said, "It is not over." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "She is going to retaliate. I need to be ready." If you are enjoying this story, hit like and subscribe because it is about to get even crazier. The next morning, I woke up to find a lien notice taped to my front door. It said I owed the HOA $4,000 in unpaid fines and compliance fees. It said if I did not pay within 30 days, the association would foreclose on my property. I took a photo of the notice. I called Mark. He said, "I did not authorize that. Karen must have filed it before she was suspended." I said, "Can she do that?" He said, "Technically, yes. She still has access to the accounts. I am working on freezing them, but it takes time." I said, "I do not have time. I need to get this removed now." He said, "You need a lawyer." I called a lawyer I knew from the union hall. Her name was Rachel. She specialized in property disputes. I explained the situation. She said, "Bring me everything you have." I met her at her office an hour later. I handed her the case file. She read through it. She said, "This is fraud, clear cut. But the lien is going to be a problem. Once it is filed, it takes months to remove, even if it is fraudulent." I said, "I cannot wait months." She said, "Then we go nuclear. We file an emergency injunction and we demand a hearing. If we can prove Karen acted in bad faith, the judge will remove the lien immediately." I said, "How fast can you do that?" She said, "I can file today. But I need one more thing. I need proof that Karen knew the fines were bogus when she filed the lien." I said, "I have emails from Rick. I have the time-stamped photos. I have the complaint log entry." She said, "That proves the fraud, but it does not prove she knew the fines were bogus. I need something that shows intent." I thought for a moment. Then I remembered. The vendor invoice for the vacant property. The one that started everything. I pulled up the budget portal on my phone. I navigated to the invoice. I showed Rachel. I said, "This invoice is for work at a property that has been vacant for 2 years. Karen approved it. She had to know it was fake." Rachel smiled. She said, "That is it. That is intent." She filed the emergency injunction that afternoon. The hearing was scheduled for the next morning at 9 a.m. I could not sleep that night. I kept thinking about what Karen would say. I kept thinking about what would happen if the judge did not believe me. The hearing was held at the Minnehaha County Courthouse. It was a small room with wooden benches and a judge's bench at the front. Rachel sat next to me. Karen sat across the aisle with a lawyer I did not recognize. The judge was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and reading glasses. She read through the filings in silence. Then she looked up. She said, "Miss Kelly, you are accused of filing a fraudulent lien. How do you respond?" Karen's lawyer stood. He said, "Your Honor, my client was acting within her authority as board secretary. The fines were issued in accordance with association bylaws." The judge said, "Were the fines valid?" Karen's lawyer hesitated. He said, "That is a matter of interpretation." Rachel stood. She said, "Your Honor, I have proof that the fines were fabricated. I also have proof that Miss Kelly knowingly approved invoices for work that was never performed. She had clear intent to defraud." The judge said, "Show me." Rachel handed her the case file. The judge read through it. She looked at the proxy forms. She looked at the invoices. She looked at the emails. She looked at Karen. She said, "Miss Kelly, did you approve this invoice?" She handed Karen the invoice for the vacant property. Karen looked at it. Her face went pale. She said, "I do not remember." The judge said, "The invoice is signed by you." Karen said, "I sign a lot of invoices. I cannot remember every one." The judge said, "This invoice is for work at a property that has been vacant for 2 years. You had to know it was fraudulent." Karen said nothing. The judge looked at Rachel. She said, "I am granting the injunction. The lien is removed. Miss Kelly, You are ordered to cease all enforcement actions pending the outcome of the association audit." Karen stood up. She said, "This is a witch hunt." The judge said, "Miss Kelly, if you continue, I will hold you in contempt." Karen sat down. I walked out of the courthouse. Rachel said, "You won." I said, "It does not feel like it." She said, "It will. Give it time." That afternoon, I got a call from Linda. She said, "The board voted to hire an independent auditor. They are starting next week." I said, "Good." She said, "Karen tried to access the accounts this morning. We caught her and locked her out. She is done." I said, "What happens now?" She said, "The auditor will find everything. If the fraud is as extensive as you think, the board will file criminal charges." I said, "How long will that take?" She said, "A few weeks, maybe a month." I said, "I can wait." The audit took 3 weeks. The auditor was a forensic accountant named David. He went through every invoice, every check, every transfer. He interviewed Rick. He interviewed Bill. He interviewed me. When he finished, he presented his findings to the board. I was not allowed to attend, but Mark called me afterward. He said, "It is worse than we thought." I said, "How bad?" He said, "Karen embezzled over $60,000 in the past 3 years. She used fake invoices, staged violations, and forged proxy votes to cover it up. She also charged compliance fees to at least 15 homeowners for violations that never happened." I said, "What is the board going to do?" He said, "We are filing a police report. We are also filing a civil suit to recover the funds. And we are refunding every bogus fee." I said, "What about the homeowners she forced out?" He said, "We are reaching out to them. If they want to join the suit, they can." I hung up and sat in my truck. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. 2 days later, Karen was arrested. The police charged her with embezzlement, fraud, and forgery. The local news ran a story. The headline said, "HOA secretary arrested for embezzlement scheme." I watched the news clip on my phone. Karen was led out of her house in handcuffs. She screamed at the reporters. She said, "This is a setup. I did nothing wrong." One of the reporters asked her about the forged proxies. She said, "Proxies are legal magic. I was just doing my job." The board held a special meeting 2 weeks later. They voted to adopt a new enforcement checklist that required board approval for every compliance action. They also voted to remove the compliance fee from the bylaws. Mark presented the audit report. He said, "We have identified 42 bogus fines issued over the past 3 years. The total amount is $23,000. We are issuing refunds to every affected homeowner." A neighbor in the front row stood up. She said, "What about the homeowners who moved?" Mark said, "We are reaching out to them. If they provide proof of payment, we will refund them as well." Another neighbor said, "What about Karen?" Mark said, "She is facing criminal charges. The trial is scheduled for next year." The room applauded. I stood up. I said, "I have one more thing." I pulled out the case file. I said, "I want this entered into the record. I want everyone to know what she did." Mark said, "Agreed." I handed him the file. He placed it on the table. He said, "This file will be kept in the association archives. Anyone who wants to review it can request access." I sat down. Travis leaned over. He said, "You did it." I said, "We did it." The trial took 11 months. I testified. Rick testified. Bill testified. David the auditor testified. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. They found Karen guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 4 years in prison and ordered her to pay full restitution. She also lost her house. I watched her walk out of the courtroom in handcuffs. She did not look at me. 6 months after the trial, I got a call from Mark. He said, "The board wants to recognize you at the next meeting. We are presenting you with a community service award." I said, "I do not need an award." He said, "You deserve it. You saved this neighborhood." I went to the meeting. The room was full. Mark presented me with a plaque. It said, "In recognition of outstanding service to the Autumn Ridge Association community." I shook his hand. I looked at the crowd. I said, "I did not do this for recognition. I did it because it was the right thing to do." The room applauded. Afterward, a neighbor I did not know came up to me. She said, "You saved my house. Karen charged me $2,000 in bogus fees. I was about to lose everything. Thank you." I said, "You are welcome." She walked away. I stood there for a moment. I thought about the case file. I thought about the proxy forms. I thought about the invoices. I thought about Karen screaming that proxies were legal magic. I smiled. The final piece came 2 months later. I got a letter from the State Attorney General's office. It said they had opened an investigation into HOA fraud statewide. They cited my case as the catalyst. They were auditing over 200 associations. I read the letter twice. Then I filed it in my case file. I never saw Karen again. I heard she was released early for good behavior. I heard she moved to another state. I heard she changed her name. I do not care. She is gone. The neighborhood is safe. The board adopted an enforcement checklist that limits Karen tactics. Her timeline was proven false with timestamps. I stared at the letter and smiled, because it proved exactly what I suspected. A statute citation read into the minutes shut the threat down. An independent audit found improper fees tied to notices, and the HOA was forced to refund a large batch of charges across the neighborhood. Karen tries to shame me and the neighbor fact-checks her instantly. The board adopts an enforcement checklist that limits Karen tactics. Karen's timeline is proven false with timestamps. A statute citation read into the minutes shuts the threat down. I still live in Autumn Ridge. I still work nights. I still pull wire and run conduit. But now, when I get mail from the HOA, I read it carefully. When I see a notice, I check the timestamps. When I see a fine, I ask for proof. And I keep my case file in a drawer, just in case. Because Karen was not the first, and she will not be the last. But the next time someone tries it, they will have to get through me first. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.